Hey folks, how are you? I am going to be going through a lecture for chapter 5. It's the lecture that I missed on Monday because I was pretty under the weather. I hope I'm going to be able to get through this without coughing too much. I should be all right. But anyway, without further ado, let's jump into it. So, the topic of today's lecture is gender. And, this is something that social scientists study quite a bit. And what we talk about when we mean gender is sex, gender, sexuality, and gender identity. So these are all different aspects of gender that we discuss when we talk about it from a social science perspective. And obviously, gender, whether we're male or female, or we identify as another gender, it's an important aspect of who we are and of our experience. So we have a few different concepts it's important just to define and get out of the way. So when we talk about sex, we mean the actual physical or physiological differences between males and females. And then when we talk about sex, we also have to understand that although the great majority of people are either biologically male or biologically female, there are some intersex people. And these are people born with chromosomal anomalies that make them difficult to classify as male or female. And intersex people can have different, phenotypes in terms of like their actual physical expression of sex, their genitalia, that sort of thing. So there's kind of a range of different versions of intersex characteristics that people can have. Having said that, this is a relatively rare, not relatively, it's a pretty rare condition, right? So again, the great majority of people are either born biologically male or biologically female. And gender is basically what we understand as being how to be male or female in our society. So it's sort of social and cultural distinctions and roles associated with being male or female. And the important thing to state right up front is that ideas of gender and gender roles can vary greatly. And so, the pictures I've chosen here on this slide, I think, reflect that. So you have two women who are, they're women. No one disputes that, and they're expressing their gender in very different ways. At the top, you have Sabrina Carpenter, who's this kind of young pop singer, and she has a very specific um, performance or expression of gender, which we would say is more traditional. It's very feminine. It's kind of sexualized. And then at the bottom, you've got Amanda Nunes, who is probably the greatest female MMA fighter of all time. Champion in two weight divisions. And she is a very different, expresses a very different version of femininity and female gender. So, just an example of how these things can vary quite a bit. We always have to keep that in mind when we talk about these categories. And also, too, it's important to say that historic and cross-cultural studies also show extreme gender role differences. So, what I mean by this is that the idea of how it is to be a man or how it is to be a woman can vary over time, and it can vary quite a bit based on what part of the world you're in. And so, there's been some interesting examples of this, historically speaking. And one was a famous anthropologist, Margaret Mead, and Margaret Mead was, she was a young anthropologist. There were not many female anthropologists in the field at the time when she was working. And so she was very interested in gender roles. And she traveled to New Guinea, and so, Southeast Asia, and was very interested in the traditional cultures she met there, like the small scale tribal societies. And she studied three different native cultures and looked at how gender roles were expressed in these different cultures. So, among one group, the Arapesh, um, she was surprised to find that both men and women showed character traits that we would consider in the West to be stereotypically feminine. So to be kind of soft spoken, to be conflict averse, this sort of thing. And this is what both genders in the Arapesh expressed. So she found that interesting. The other group of people she went and lived with, the Mondugamor, she sort of saw through her research that quite opposite to the Arapesh, in this culture, both men and women expressed what she would consider traditionally masculine character traits, right? So being more aggressive, more confrontational, and very different from what we would consider to be traditional feminine behavior in terms of the women in that society. So she sees two societies where everyone behaving stereotypically feminine, everyone behaving stereotypically masculine, and then another group she went to study among the Chambuli. She found gender roles that are pretty much reversed. So among the Chambuli, women tended to be more dominant, more aggressive, more expressive, more confrontational, more out in the world, whereas men tended to be more sort of quiet and more sort of focused on domestic affairs. And this was very, very different from the way gender is expressed in North America. So it was an interesting example of anthropological research, which points out just how different human cultures can be, even when it comes to things as fundamental as being a man or being a woman. If we look throughout history as well, there's some really interesting examples of how gender can, in some cases, be reinforced in terms of what we experience today as masculinity and femininity, but also how it can be really undermined or changed or challenged, I should say. And so, an example of this is the ancient Spartans. So, the Spartans were, as advertised in the sense that they were a very, very intense warrior culture. So, masculinity was highly valued among the Spartans. It was violent. You had to be tough as nails. You had to be an excellent fighter. You were in incredible shape. All of those things about the Spartans were true. They were looked up to among the ancient, communities of the time that they existed within, especially in ancient Greece. They were looked up as almost like the manly ideals, right? These were tough dudes. So that seems to be pretty much like in keeping with stereotypes of masculinity today. Very tough, expert fighters, warriors, all this. However, what was interesting about the Spartans was that they were also very, very interested and invested in their personal appearance. So looking beautiful was important to Spartans. So there's writings about them among ancient Greek historians before battles, kind of like lounging around and like combing their hair and making sure they've got ringlets and jewelry and stuff on, so they look really good, as well as being super tough and very violent and effective fighters. Also very interested in their personal appearance. And what was interesting about the Spartans too is that they also had almost kind of like institutionalized homosexuality that was a part of their culture as well. So the idea here was that adult men would often get into relationships with boys, and from their perspective, this was seen as part of just being an ultra manly man, right? And so, very interesting how different that is to sort of stereotypical aspects of masculinity in North American culture, where being gay is seen as being outside of sort of traditional masculine conceptions of what it is to be a man. So again, historically speaking, things change quite a bit. We see this also in terms of women. So we know that in our society, women are not seen as aggressive or warlike as men, not at all. And I would say that you do see this general trend in most societies. However, there have been notable exceptions. So among ancient Scandinavian, Celtic, Germanic, and even African cultures, women could often be powerful and respected warriors. So there's a few different examples I want to give you. So one is Boudica, who was queen of the Celtic Iceni tribe in Britain. And this is when the Roman Empire was expanding from the Italian peninsula, expanding up into Europe. It was encountering different peoples, encountering Celts and Germanic peoples. And Boudica was the leader of one of the larger tribes of the Celtic people, the Iceni, and they fought a bitter, bitter war against Rome. And Boudica herself led an uprising against Roman occupation in her country. So very, very strong, very powerful, very famous warrior queen. Cartamandua, another very famous warrior queen of another tribe. This is the Brigantines. And so they were also fighting the Romans in Britain at the time. And she ruled from AD 43 to AD 69. So that's a fair amount of time, again, for a strong female queen, warrior queen who ruled. In a more recent example in Africa, this is really interesting. So the West African kingdom of Dahomey in the 1700s and 1800s, they had this army known as the Agoji, and the Agoji were an all-female army, and they were widely feared and respected as being excellent fighters, like by all the surrounding communities, and also by European colonists and conquerors who came in to try and take over the land. And the Agoji primarily fought against the French. As the French were trying to, colonize Africa and trying to take over different countries, and the French remarked at just how like vicious and intense and fierce these female warriors were. So clearly, there are examples in different human societies at different times in history where you have expressions of femininity, of being a woman, that are quite different from sort of stereotypical notions of femininity in North American society today. And so, what we're basically talking about here is the fact that you can have a gender. So, for instance, I'm a man, right? And I identify as a man. But the way I express my masculinity could be quite different from the way other men do. So, gender identity is my sense of being a man. So, it's everyone's sense of being either male or female. Gender expression, though, is how you choose to express your gender identity. And of course, we know that can be quite different. And of course, we also know that there are some people who do not express either a masculine or feminine identity. And so we have, today gender variability, but, it's important. And I'm going to talk about this too. This has always existed in human cultures. Like when we look back throughout history, when we look across the world, you always do see this gender variability. So not everyone ever fits neatly into the binary categories of male and female. Most of us do, but some of us have always not. So gender variable, these are the folks that are gender nonconformist, non-binary, or sometimes the word use is gender queer. And so these people challenge the male-female binary. Um, so an interesting thing is when we start talking about sex and gender, we start talking about a lot of interesting issues playing out in our society right now, and a lot of them are in fact legal issues about, you know, is the relationship between sex and gender? Are they the same? Are they different? To what extent does gender identity overrule one's own actual sex, like your biological sex? And so, an example that I wanted to touch on that's mentioned, sorry, in the textbook is a legal case decided in 2002 between it's Nixon versus the Vancouver Rape Relief Society. And so, in this legal case, a trans woman named Kimberly Nixon wanted to be a volunteer at the Vancouver Rape Relief Society, the VRRS. However, the VRRS has a policy that only women can be volunteers when talking about, rape crisis relief, that sort of thing. And so they said, Kimberly, sorry, you can't be a volunteer. And Kimberly said, well, if I'm a trans woman, I should be treated like a woman. So my human rights are being violated. So Kimberly challenged this under law. And what was really interesting about the decision is that, and I think it shows the complexity of these issues. So this was in British Columbia, and the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal ruled that Kimberly was in fact being discriminated against. So she was being told she couldn't participate as a volunteer based on her biological sex, right? And that was discriminatory. However, then the Vancouver Rape Relief Society appealed this decision to the Supreme Court. And the court really nuanced this further. So the court said that, yes, it's true that Kimberly's being discriminated against. However, this was due to the special nature of the Vancouver Rape Relief Society. And so, what the court ruled is that because the VRRS is, a group specifically for biological women that deals with issues that biological women encounter in terms of, relationships and sex and sexual violence. Because of that, they had the right to define their space as woman only, and then to define a woman as someone who was born and has lived all their life as a female. So again, this really shows that we're talking about some complex issues, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later on as well when we talk about how these things intersect: your physical characteristics, how you're born biologically, and your gender. Right? Complex interactions here. So basically, the challenge here is when you're talking about the situation like the Vancouver Rape Relief Center, or you're talking about, for instance, in the most recent Olympics, where you had this Algerian boxer who was very controversial. She was competing in the women's league in boxing, or category in boxing, and yet she was intersexed, and so had, let's say, biological characteristics that were not stereotypically feminine. There was a lot of controversy and kind of outrage over this. And one of the issues that we encounter in these situations is competing rights. Okay. And what this means is that you have, first of all, the human rights of trans people to be free from discrimination, right? Which is in under law in Canada. So in Canada, it is illegal to discriminate against trans people. This was, I think, a very important piece of legislation. I believe it was 2016 that it came into effect in Canada. Before this time, people have to remember that you could just decide to fire someone because they were trans. You could decide you weren't going to rent an apartment to them. You could just really discriminate in any way, which Canadians normally feel is not appropriate to do to anyone, right? It'd be like saying, like, oh yeah, I'm going to fire you because you're black, right? You could do that to trans people before this legislation. So it was very important legislation to protect the human rights of trans people. However, so that's one set of rights, but these rights then compete against the rights of people born as biologically female. In particular, the right of women to define women only spaces. And this includes women being able to compete against other women in athletics, especially high level athletics, right? So this is really competing rights. And that's what makes these challenging cases and challenging things to think about. And a lot of times, it's unfortunate that the complexity gets drowned out because the two sides in the debate tend to be super passionate and super vocal, right? So, if you're a real radical trans activist, any attempt to say that a trans woman isn't exactly the same as a normal woman, that's treated as being like transphobic or whatnot. On the other hand, you have some people who are saying we need women's only spaces, who will then go further and say, well, trans women, that's not even a thing. It's just men playing dress up, right? So things get a little bit distorted and intense on that side as well. So this is what makes it sort of challenging. You also not only have competing rights in these cases, you also have rights versus obligations. Okay. And what this means is that we all have human rights as members of our society, but we also have obligations. And one of the obligations we have is to protect youth. Okay. This is why we have age limits for things like drinking and driving. and also for agreeing to certain medical procedures, like such as really invasive plastic surgeries. And so the idea here is that we are supposed to, as a society, protect young people from making decisions that will have irreversible life impact, and making them at an age where they're not fully able to understand that impact, or they're not fully able to think their way through it. And so clearly we have a big challenge here then around trans youth and gender affirming care, right? A big debate that's unfolding right now. And again, like I said, these are complex issues. There are real debates here. And I think it's important that we separate um, the real legal issues out from the highly polarized and inflammatory language of both pro and anti-trans advocates, right? I'm someone who fully supports trans rights. I'll just be really open about that. But I think there's real debates here, right? Like I actually think you can't just simplify what's being discussed and debated in terms of trans rights, also versus the rights of women to define women-only spaces. Very, very challenging stuff. So we have sex, we have gender, we also have sexuality, which is another aspect, of course, of gender. And we're not going to talk too much about it in this lecture because I talk about that more in the lecture that we're going to do next Monday. So sexuality includes your sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, and this is, either heterosexuality, and again, the great majority of people in Canada are heterosexual, or homosexuality, where you're attracted to the same sex, or you're bisexual, which means you're attracted to both sexes. And there's also a category, a more recent addition of people who are asexual, who really don't feel sexual attraction at all towards either sex. And so our study of sexuality involves, sexual identities, how people express their sexual orientation, obviously, practices that are associated with that, and then also how social forms and family forms relate to sexual orientation, such as monogamy, polyamory, sexual rites of passage, i.e., how someone assumes a mature sexual identity. All of these things vary based on one's sexual orientation. So again, sexuality, we're going to talk about it next slide, so I'm not going to get too much into it, but it is an important aspect of gender. The one thing I will just talk a little bit about is the fact that Canada is an interesting case because for years, in fact, for most of our history, Canada was a very homophobic country or heteronormative country. So heteronormativity is where being heterosexual is just seen as the normal, the natural, the standard way to be. To a certain extent, this is understandable, folks, because 96% of Canadians identify as heterosexual. Anytime you have a minority that great, they're going to tend to think that they're just the norm, right? However, even though only about 4% of Canadians identify as LGBTQ2 plus, that's still a lot of people in the country, right? 4% is no joke in a country of 40 million people. So there's a lot of people who identify as non-heterosexual. And so it has been a challenge for a lot of years for these folks because Canada, like I said, was extremely homophobic. And homophobia is an extreme or irrational aversion to homosexuals, right? And this is something that we always have to remember, right? When we talk about things like, gay rights or not being homophobic, it's not necessarily that you have to totally embrace someone else's sexual orientation or sexual practices. It's not that you have to be attracted to the same things they are, or even necessarily approve of what they're attracted to or what they do or whatnot. That's not it. The point here, though, is not to view those people as being less than, not entitled to protections, not entitled to human rights, not entitled to the same access as all of us, right, to what our society provides, right? So that's really, what homophobia is all about. Homophobia is really people who denigrate the identity of others just because they're non-heterosexual. So again, it wasn't until 1996 that it was illegal, sorry, to discriminate against someone for their sexual identity. So again, up until 1996, if you like, this is why so many people who were gay and lesbian and bisexual existed in what they call the closet, right? Because it was dangerous to be known to be openly homosexual. If you worked, for instance, at a business where you knew your boss was like kind of progressive and was like, listen, I don't care if you're straight or gay, whatever, then you were okay. But if you lived, or sorry, if you worked in a company where the owners or senior management were homophobic, you could lose your job just like that, right? You could not, you could be kicked out of your housing. So you could be discriminated against legally all the way up until 1996. So that's pretty recently that we made those changes. Sorry. Um, and then also, sorry, the last thing on that previous slide was that same sex marriage became legal in Canada in 2005. This was a big breakthrough. Folks, I will just say, as someone who's lived through some of this, I remember all of the panic and fear mongering and hair pulling that was going on about same sex marriage, where a lot of very conservative religious folks and just a lot of homophobic people were basically saying that Canadian society was going to fall apart, and men and women were not going to get married anymore, and all of a sudden we'd all turn gay overnight. And it's interesting to see in hindsight, after 20 years of gay marriage in Canada, just what a non issue it is for the society as a whole. I want to be clear. For for gay people, it was a huge issue, right? And it was a major change to be able to be legally recognized in marriage. But as the society as a whole, like, no one cares today. So it's kind of interesting. We have to keep this in mind sometimes when society is confronted with challenges, right, to our accepted ways of doing things and thinking about things. So, anyway, moving on, I want to talk a little bit about gender roles. Like, how do we learn to be men and women in our society? Well, clearly, we're socialized into these roles. So, from a young age, we're given ideas of what it is to be a man or a woman. And in our society, a lot of this involves what we call traditional gender roles. So the idea that, masculinity is about being strong, aggressive, dominant. Femininity is about being passive, nurturing, and subordinate. Now, folks, let's be real. These traditional ideas have really been shaken up, I'd say, over the last 2 decades. Things are, I think, a lot more fluid and less traditional in terms of men and women. But I think when we read these, we still have a sense of like, yeah, I get it, I get it. There's still that sense that men need to be this way and that women need to be a certain way as well. And we can maybe see this a little bit in terms of the social roles that men and women find themselves in. So, for instance, men are more represented in law enforcement, the military, and politics, whereas women are more represented in childcare, healthcare, and social work. So there is, whether it's based on natural tendencies or based on social pressures, there is this tendency for men and women to occupy somewhat different social roles. Having said that, there's also a heck of a lot of overlap, right? So if you're talking about doctors and lawyers and engineers and athletes and whatever, I mean, it's almost a total blur in terms of whether men or women are more represented. It really depends on a given situation. So, gender roles, and again, throughout the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of work done about what are traditional stereotypical gender roles, right? In 1974, sociological researcher Bem came up with a sex role inventory. And this looked at characteristics as being either sex typed, i.e., associated with masculinity or femininity, or being non-typed, which means that they're kind of like either gender could be these things, right? So, for instance, if we look at the very first item on the list, items for evaluating masculinity, self-reliant. So you hear this a lot with men, right? The idea that it's important for men to be self-reliant. Okay. Now, the counterpart to that among women is that women need to be more yielding, right? So more likely to take another person's perspective on, more likely to ask for help, that sort of thing. However, a non typed characteristic is being helpful, right? So, this is the kind of thing that's generally seen as being good, whether you're a man or a woman, right? It's good to be helpful. So, this just sort of shows that certain aspects of our behavior are very associated with masculinity or femininity, whereas others are not so much. They're seen as more neutral. Gender roles, probably one of the most powerful stories or powerful vehicles for storytelling about gender is the media. Um, and so, we get these presentations a lot. James Bond is just one example. We talked a little bit in previous classes about the culture industry and its representations of women and men and how they're hyper emphasized, right? So we get a lot of this. However, there is also considerable variation in the performance of gender roles and also in terms of how we adhere to gender roles. Um, for the one thing, ideas of what it means to be a man or a woman, they vary based on our other identities. Our, whether we're part of a racialized group, our social class, our ethnicity, our ethnic group, our sexuality, all of these things vary and influence how we express being a man or a woman. Classic example of this that you often see in North American culture is that more working class masculinity tends to be more focused on being physically strong, tough, independent, this sort of thing, but also capable, good with your hands, able to solve problems. Like there's a lot of things that more working class masculinity focuses on, whereas more upper class masculinity tends to be more focused on wealth, political power, um, you know, uh, personal appearance, conspicuous consumption, like having fancy suits and fancy cars and stuff, right? So there's differences around class. There's differences, like I said, in terms of your ethnic group, how you express masculinity or femininity. There's also a lot of gender stereotypes again that we see in the media. There's these character types we get, like men as either like the jock, the nerd, the player, the womanizer, or the sensitive artsy guy. There's like these different categories. Women, we see it as well. There's women who are more tomboys, who are more traditionally feminine, women who are seen as independent career women. So there's these various categories almost, or flavors of gender that we're presented with in popular culture and able to see if we like to try on, see if it helps us express ourselves. In 1955, Connell did some really good research on. Hey, folks. Sorry about. I just had to take a little quick break there and refresh my tea, so I don't start coughing a bunch. Yeah, in terms of talking about gender roles, again, I just want to deal quickly with Connell. Talking about what I just mentioned before, that if you look at representations in media and popular culture, there tends to be what he calls hegemonic masculinity, which means men should first of all avoid and reject any feminine behavior, uh, must seek power, success, and the admiration of others, must be rational, tough, and self reliant, and also must be daring, aggressive, and risk taking. And so this is kind of like your standard action hero model, right, of what it is to be a man. And in the same sense, women in popular culture display what Connell referred to as emphasized femininity. So that means women should be supportive, nurturing, empathic, enthusiastic, and sexually attractive. So again, think about your standard love interest in a romantic comedy or in an action movie or whatnot, right? So what's interesting, folks, is I think we all know life is far more complicated and diverse than this representation. And yet, it's interesting that we do still keep seeing it. So it's relatively persistent. Um, transgender, of course, are people who identify, I should say, as a gender that is not um, concurrent with their biological sex. It's approximately 0.24% of the population. So again, this is not a big group of people. Um, However, transgenderism is something that is found throughout the world. So this is by no means just a North American phenomenon, not even close. And it's also been found since ancient times. So if we think back to, historical accounts, whether it's ancient Greek and Roman civilization, whether it's ancient, African cultures, there has always been, or in the Asian cultures as well, and traditions, there's always been um, transgender individuals. There's always been people who identify with the other sex. And in North America, for instance, among a number of Native communities, they have this notion of what's called two spirit, um, which is a way of talking about transgenderism. And the idea is that one person has two spirits living within them, a male and a female spirit, right? And in a lot of First Nations cultures, two spirit people were seen as unusual to a certain extent, in the sense that not common, but not not weird, not like they were seen as normal parts of the community. And if anything, they were seen as having some special sort of ritualistic status, because having this two spirit status. But they didn't have a lower status in the communities. And so today we talk about either male to female or female to male transsexuals, or transgender. The earlier term sort of was transsexual. It's been replaced by transgender. So again, we have people who are born biologically women who identify as men. So they choose to reorient their gender and live as men. We have people born as biological males who identify as women. So they change their gender identity and expression to that of being female. And again, many trans people actually don't undergo a lot of surgeries. They don't alter their body. However, some do. And that is something that is leading to, like I said earlier, controversy around the age at which these procedures happen. It's a really interesting question about what causes transgenderism. And I don't think there's any coherent idea on that right now. Most people feel it's like a blend of genetics, hormone levels. So, like, what kind of hormones we're exposed to in utero, and then also social and cultural factors as well. So, it's a very complex mix that probably lies behind how some people feel, from a very young age, that they were quote unquote born into the wrong body. So what we found in Canada, similar to when I was saying about with just homosexuality in general, is Canada was a very intolerant society for a long time, with trans people as well. So, and the problem then was trans people faced a lot of discrimination. So, twice as likely to experience assault or discrimination as non-trans people. Trans youth are 5 times more likely to experience suicidal thoughts, 7.6 times more likely to attempt suicide. And a lot of this is due to discrimination and stigmatization. And so, for this reason, and after years of advocacy, Canada passed Bill C-16. And it was, sorry, I mentioned earlier it was 2016. It was 2017 that Bill C-16 was passed. And this basically made gender identity and gender expression as prohibited grounds for discrimination. So you couldn't legally discriminate against someone just for being transgender. And this is a very important step forward in protecting the rights of trans people in Canada. And so As part of this removing discrimination from trans folks, the government has started to fund what's known as gender affirming care, and Ontario, for instance, does this as well. Because in Canada, um, health policy is a provincial thing, not necessarily a federal thing. The federal government gives money to the provinces to administer healthcare, but provinces actually do health policy. So each province has its own way of approaching this. In Ontario, we have gender affirming care. So that means trans people can access gender affirming care that is supported by the healthcare system. And the controversial issues really are in terms of surgeries. Okay, so top surgery has to be a minimum of 16 years of age before someone can apply for it, and a minimum of 18 years of age for bottom surgery. And so, and again, these are dates, age ranges that are being fought over, right, as we speak. There are people that think they're too old. So, for instance, like radical trans activists would say, you know what? If a child is 5 years old and likes, a young boy and likes to wear dresses and stuff like that, you should let them start taking hormones and stuff like that. Of course, there are people who are opposed to this who say that 16 years of age is way too young. For instance, for a young woman to get her breasts removed because she wants to live as a man. So, like I said, this is a very, very live issue right now in Canada. And gender affirming care is outlined by the Canadian Professional Association for Transgender Health, or CPATH. And it should just be stressed as well that this is a very, very new field of medicine, right? And there's a lot of debate about the use and effectiveness of surgery, puberty blockers, etc. So all this is being sorted out kind of as we speak. And what makes it complicated is, first of all, from the research that I've seen, that I've looked at, most transgender individuals who undergo what's known as gender affirming surgery, so to surgically modify their body to make it look more like their chosen gender, most of those people have positive outcomes. Okay. So we have to keep that in mind. However, we also have to keep in mind that there are people who don't have a good outcome. There are people who actually regret surgeries. There are even people who go through what's known as detransition, which is real, and regret the whole process. Now, the challenge is right now we don't have a good idea of rates of detransition or rates of people who've had a bad experience with surgery. It appears that the rate of detransition is relatively low, between 1 and 10% of people who go through gender affirming surgery. However, it's really important that we get a better handle on this, because if it's 1% of people versus 10% of people, that has an impact in terms of what decisions you make around how old you need to be to get these surgeries, that sort of thing, right? So, and I would say this is one of these cases as well where the far sides on either side of this debate are, I think, overly politicizing things. So, for instance, there are, really, really intense pro-trans activists who are saying detransition doesn't exist. It's not a thing. It's made up. That's completely not true. Like, so that's wrong. However, there are also people who are, on the anti-trans side of things, that pretend that every second person who gets gender affirming surgery has a horrible experience and detransitions. That's completely not true too. So I hope you can see that in a highly politicized, very controversial issue like this, it takes time for the real research to come through and actually tell us what we're dealing with. Okay. And this is something that's happening right now in Canadian society. So if we think about gender so far, right? Male, female, trans identities, intersex people, kind of have a sense of how it works. The thing is, what makes gender interesting, though, is that gender is something that seems very kind of natural, a natural part of our identity. Okay, for most people, anyway. And so the dominant and accepted way of thinking about gender, because it feels so natural, is that sex is a biological category that produces only two options, male or female. And gender is a social and psychological construct that expresses biological sex. either masculine or feminine. So the dominant way of thinking about gender is that it is directly linked to sex. Again, as I mentioned previously, the great majority of people have a gender in line with their biological sex. So there's a reason why this is kind of the dominant way of thinking about it. And in this dominant paradigm, one can't change their gender without major medical intervention. So this is a very sort of biologically focused way of thinking about it, right? So the idea here is that if a man all of a sudden decides to start wearing dresses and refer to themselves as a woman or whatnot, this perspective would be like, well, no, sorry, you're not. You're just a cross dresser, right? You're still a man. And so, yeah, this is something that is very prevalent, I would say, in the popular culture in Canada today. This view. However, if you think about it, there is another perspective that we really have to think about. And researchers, for instance, like Fausto Sterling in 2000, she did a lot of research among, transgendered and gender variable people. And she argues that, in fact, sex and gender are actually more fluid than that dominant way of thinking about it would lead us to believe. So, Fausto Sterling points out to kind of what I said earlier, that gender is socially constructed and it's performative. And that means it could be performed different ways by different people, right? And if the performance, she argues, if it happens to align with the dominant idea of gender, i.e., if you're born a man and you act in stereotypically masculine ways, she argues that, well, society kind of rewards you. It's like, good boy, okay, you're doing the right stuff. Same thing with a woman, right? If it's like, you like traditionally feminine things, you behave in traditionally feminine ways, the idea is that the culture rewards you, right? However, if your gender expression conflicts with the dominant gender stereotype, it tends to be rejected, criticized, and discouraged. And so, again, when we look at both these perspectives, I think it's important to be critical. Critical of both. So, the dominant gender schema. There's only males. There's only females. There's only men. There's only women. End of story. Right? Is this wholly correct? Well, clearly it isn't. Right? Yes, it expresses the reality of a great many of us. However, by no means is it expressing the reality of everyone. So, first of all, it ignores intersex individuals, like we mentioned at the start of the lecture, and it ignores the varied cultural expressions of masculinity and femininity that we see both within Canada and around the world. And it also ignores third genders and transgender identities. So, actually, this dominant way of viewing gender as being this black and white, there's only male, there's only female, that doesn't hold up. Um, However, does that then mean that sex and gender are totally unrelated? Are they completely fluid and socially constructed? And again, there are activists in the trans community and in the LGBTQ 2+ community who definitely make these arguments that actually it's all totally random. You could wake up tomorrow and decide to be a different gender, have a different sexual orientation, whatever. There are people that really try and say that there really is no relationship between your biology and your gender idea, right? However, we know that that's not true either, right? So, otherwise there wouldn't be this incredibly strong correlation between biological sex and gender identity and gender expression. Again, we have to remember 99.75% of people have a biological identity that corresponds with their biological sex, i.e., you're born a cis man, you see yourself as a man. You're born a cis woman, you see yourself as a woman. You could be straight or gay, bisexual, whatever, but you still see yourself as the gender in alignment with your sex. The great majority of us feel this way. Um, there's also been some really interesting cases that show that biology and gender are in fact strongly related. And one of the more tragic ones is the case of David Reimer. And people may have encountered this story before in previous classes. Anyway, the Reimers were a family living in Winnipeg, Manitoba. They had two young boys. They were actually a Mennonite family, two young boys, and the one young boy, Bruce, was undergoing circumcision, and in a really horrible accident, he actually had his penis burned off, and when he was very young, and so of course everyone was just horrified by this, and the parents didn't know what to do, and they encountered a doctor who had kind of a radical idea of like, well, you know what, why not just raise the one brother as a girl? And so, to try and undergo, give the young boy hormones, try and fashion the damaged male genitalia into female genitalia, like try and just raise this child as a young girl. And so this is basically what the parents kind of didn't know. They were taking the advice of the doctors. They're like, okay, we're gonna have one daughter, one son. So this young boy Bruce became Brenda and was raised as a young girl. And the researcher, I think his name was John Money, very interesting name. The psychologist who was overseeing this whole treatment had very radical views on gender fluidity. Basically, Money was like, yeah, you can pretty much decide to raise a girl as a boy or a boy as a girl, doesn't matter. It's just about how you socialize them, that sort of thing. And so they tried all through Brenda's young life to get them to live as a girl, but Brenda never felt like a girl, always felt like a boy, was incredibly depressed, and really ultimately suicidal at the age of 16 until um, Brenda's parents finally said, "Listen, okay, sorry, this is what happened." They came clean, and then immediately Brenda started living as a man, changed his name to David, so David Reimer, and lived as a man for the rest of his life. Now, tragically, his life wasn't very long. David killed himself. I think he was like 38 years old. Committed suicide. His brother had committed suicide a few years earlier. So sadly, a very troubled childhood, very troubled family situation. But what it really shows is that clearly there's a strong link between biology and our notions of gender. You can't simply just socially condition someone's gender without factoring in their biology as well, right? So they're not that fluid after all, right? So again, not surprisingly, I think we're seeing a recurring theme here. When we're talking about these complex issues of sex, sexuality, and gender, um, all or nothing arguments just don't make sense, right? They don't really add up. The reality is a lot more complex, and that's what researchers are still trying to get at. So, if we look at how gender affects our experience in a broader sense in society, we also come to the realization that gender is associated with power. Okay, so it's a meaningful category that gives some people benefits and takes them away from other people, right? And so, for instance, this concept of patriarchy, I'm sure we've all heard this term before. Patriarchy is a set of institutions and structures that privileges men and disadvantages women. And just as I said, Canada used to be a homophobic society for many years. It also used to be a very patriarchal society. So when we say society is very patriarchal, it means that it gives men a lot of privileges and it takes a lot away from women, a lot of control and a lot of, opportunity, right? An example again, if we look around the world, a lot of people would point to a country, for instance, like Saudi Arabia, where women are quite limited in terms of what they can do, in terms of going out in the world on their own, and getting jobs and driving and doing all these things. Afghanistan would be another more extreme example of that. Um, Very patriarchal societies where women are kind of controlled and very limited in what they can do. Um, Again, historically speaking, Canada was like this as well. So before 1859, a married woman couldn't own or control her own property. So that was interesting. Before 1909, abducting a woman was not a crime. And this sounds insane. A woman who is not an IRS. So you could, here's the thing, you could abduct a woman for marriage. You could literally like steal her from her family, take her away, force her to marry you, and that was not illegal. It sounds insane to say that, but it's true before 1909. Of course, before 1918, women couldn't vote. And before 1929, women were not even considered legal persons, like persons able to own businesses and, own stocks and like, do this sort of stuff, right? They weren't even considered fully legal persons until 1929. Before 1953, employers could legally pay a woman less than a man for the exact same job just by being like, yeah, you're a woman. I'm going to give you half what the guy's getting, right? Which used to happen. And then before 1969 in Canada, women could not get access to safe and legal abortion. So clearly, we can see over time there's been this, slow process of changing Canadian society to be less patriarchal and more egalitarian when it comes to gender, more sort of like neutral towards the genders. And so, really, this involves like undoing decades of historical sexism. And sexism is the belief in the innate inferiority of the opposite sex. I mean, both men and women can be sexist, it's true. However, obviously, male sexism in the form of patriarchy has been a way, way more socially disruptive force throughout Canadian society. So, again, we are socialized into stereotypical gender norms as we grow up. The toys we play with, the kinds of play we engage in, the colors, the clothes we wear, even such things as in high school. Do you take a shop class? That's when I was in high school anyway. You had an option. You could take a class where you would, go into wood shop and you'd build shelves and stuff, or you could take a course that was called home economics back in the day. And it was about, things like, literally cooking and cleaning and that sort of stuff. And it was very, very gendered in terms of who went to those, who took those different classes. What's interesting too about gender socialization is we see different patterns. So, for instance, girls are generally given a little more leeway in their gender conformity. So, it's more acceptable, for instance, for a girl to be a tomboy than it is for a boy to be perceived as overly feminine. The overly feminine boy will tend to get more negative feedback and pays more of a heavy cost for nonconformity. Um, However, in general, girls are expected to follow rules more, so to be more conscientious, while boys are given greater freedom to break rules, right? Boys will be boys. Oh, they're just going to go off and run around and do whatever. Um, as well, fathers in North America tend to be more enforcing of traditional gender roles. So they tend to be more concerned with, whether their son's acting like a son and a daughter's acting like a daughter. And in school, there's also different behaviors that emerge in the sense that boys tend to be called on more by teachers and tend to be praised more than girls. And of course, in popular culture, gender is a powerful signifier. There used to be heavily male dominated in terms of pop culture, but that has changed a lot. With the example here, this is Ironheart, and an Iron Man spinoff with a strong female character. That there's been a lot of change, I'd say, over especially like the last 10 years. With representations in popular culture. So that's sort of changing right now in Canadian society. But for years, it was very, very male dominated and traditional in its presentation. So, one of the things that it's important to look at when we look at gender is gender inequality, right? And this is kind of what patriarchy gets at, the whole idea that if you live in a patriarchal system, if men are getting more advantages and more opportunities and more freedom, that tends to translate into more wealth and power. And it does, right? So you see some interesting differences between men and women in Canada. on different aspects of their economic lives. The first part is that if you look at how much labor is devoted to looking after children and elders, women in Canada still do more of that than men. So, for instance, a 2010 Canadian study showed that women spent an average of 50 hours a week looking after children, while men spent an average of 24.4 hours. So, women spend about twice the time looking after kids than men do. And of course, this is the case that there are more women than men who don't work, who just look after kids full time. However, that is nowhere near as much as it used to be going back like 50, 60, 70 years. Today, women make up 48% of the labor force. So almost exactly half of the labor force. Most women are working. There are still some women who instead look after children full time, but it's a lot less than it used to be. When you look at the jobs women do in the labor force, though, they tend to be more part-time workers and more of minimum wage workers. And in average, for every hour worked in our economy today, women make about 83% of what men do. And that's up from 76% in 1988. And this is what's sometimes known as the gender pay gap, right? Which has obviously been narrowing, but it still does exist. And the gender pay gap has a lot of different aspects to it, right? So, first of all, it is definitely due to discrimination. So, this means unequal rewards for comparable work. There is still a bit of that happening. I think a lot of people would argue that there's less of that happening than there used to be. So, what I mean by this, folks, is it's a lot less likely today that two people will get hired for the exact same job and that a man will just get more money than the women will. So, that form of direct discrimination is less likely, but it is still happening. One of the big things, though, is this idea that we have gendered occupations. Women tend to work in more lower paid fields and tend to do more part time work. Also, previously we mentioned the domestic work. If women are doing so much more domestic work, excuse me, they have less time to work for income. And then also, there's the question of perceived value, which is that society tends to undervalue stereotypically female work. We see this in terms of what uh, educational assistants make, what child and youth workers make. I mean, people that work with youth and elderly, people who work as caregivers, for instance, are really, really undervalued economically. They do not make what they should be making at all. So this is part of it as well. All of this, when you look at the statistics overall, account for this gender pay gap. And I have this a really incredible woman on the slide here, and she is a feminist economist. Her name is Marilyn Waring. Very, very fascinating person. She was the youngest member of the New Zealand federal parliament. Her family are dairy farmers in New Zealand. And she just is a really smart lady who asked some very, very difficult questions about how economics works, how the global economy works, right? And she ended up going on getting her PhD in economics and writing a great book called Sex, Lies, and the Global Economy. And it was a real eye-opening book and game-changing book for me when I encountered it. Because basically, Marilyn Waring talks about how global, excuse me, accounting and economic systems actually devalue women's work, especially domestic work. An example she gives is you could be looking at, for instance, a village, a small village in Nigeria, let's say. And there is a woman, she has kids, she has a husband, again, she's living in a small village far from built up city. And this woman might be working 12 to 14 hours a day, like waking up first thing in the morning to get water for her family, cooking them all breakfast before everyone goes to school or work, repairing things around the home, looking after animals, you know, producing more meals. So this woman, she says, basically is working from sunup until sundown, nonstop. However, because she's not out at a quote unquote job making money, our economy considers her work to be almost valueless, right? She gets no income and it doesn't really count anywhere, right? So Marilyn Waring points out just how weird this is because our societies couldn't survive without all of this basic work, right? So why don't we recognize it? The more you think of it, the more you realize it really doesn't make a lot of sense. And in contrast, our societies, our economies reward actually often toxic masculine behaviors like war and also exploitation, the drug trade, the arms trade, that sort of stuff. You can make tons of money doing that stuff. But, you know, a poor rural woman working all day long to support her family, she's completely meaningless, according to our economy. So I think this shows just how arbitrary the way we think about, money and business and economy and value, how arbitrary they are, and also how biased, how patriarchal they are. So to finish off, I'd like to talk about obviously a really important thing we need to discuss in terms of gender is feminism. Movements of women, over the last decades, who have advocated for women's rights, women's freedom, and also they've contributed a lot to just our understanding of gender in general, right? So feminist theorists help us describe gender inequality. They helped us criticize gender roles that disempowered women, and also helped us describe and analyze the patriarchal system. Okay, and feminism came in several different waves. The first wave of feminists, you're going back here to the early 1900s, excuse me, and even the late 1800s. These were women who advocated for basic rights for women to own property, to vote, and to gain full legal and human rights. Um, and they were very important. They got the vote for women in most countries, in the West anyway, in the early 1900s. The second wave of feminism was more associated with expanding the rights of women. And so, an important contribution to this was what's known as Marxist feminism. And if you go back to 1884, Friedrich Engels, who is Marx's co-author, wrote about the dual exploitation of women. So he basically was saying poor women are exploited by capitalism in the sense that they're getting, not paid enough by their employers, but they're also getting exploited by patriarchy because they're doing all this unpaid labor in the home. A really important character in second wave feminism, Betty Friedan, wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique in 1963. She was a really interesting woman, a psychologist, a labor journalist, a Marxist. And she basically said that it's really important that women have economic independence. That if women don't control their own economic situation, then they're never going to get free and emancipated. And so this sort of thinking was instrumental in the second wave of feminism, the idea that women need to work towards full equality with men. The second wave of feminism really, was all through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Made a lot of changes in terms of, women's status in North America in particular. And then in the 90s, a third wave of feminism emerged. And it was in response to 1992, an article written by Rebecca Walker. And she's the bottom picture here on the screen. And she was writing in response to Anita Hill's testimony against Clarence Thomas's U.S. Supreme Court nomination. So here's what's going on. Clarence Thomas is being nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas is a black man, but he's very, very conservative. And so he was seen as being the perfect opportunity to get the first black man on the U.S. Supreme Court because, again, like I said, he's very conservative. Um, and in the nomination hearing, one of his previous colleagues, this woman Anita Hill, again, she's a black woman, she basically said that while she was working with Clarence Thomas, for the whole time she was working with him, he was sexually harassing her nonstop, like really making her life hell and saying inappropriate things, constantly hitting on her, being very inappropriate. And she said this as part of the testimony and was like, I don't think this guy should be on the Supreme Court because of this. And what happened was the media, instead of, saying, oh, wow, Clarence Thomas sounds like he's a problem, they attacked Anita Hill. And so it was a really kind of shocking wake up call for a lot of women because they were like, what? This poor woman, she's a professional, she's a lawyer. She goes to work for this guy, gets sexually harassed nonstop for years. And then she speaks up about it and she's the one that gets in trouble. So they were like, this is messed up. So a third wave of feminism got kicked off. And this one looked a lot at intersectionality, so how race and class factors into feminist analysis. This form of feminism was also more sex positive than earlier forms. So it wasn't as sort of like, quote unquote, anti sex as first and second wave feminism was. You even had things like slut walks happening, where women were sort of trying to reclaim our sense of like, listen, I can go outside looking good, and it doesn't mean I want to get harassed by someone, right? Um, you had ecofeminism, postmodern feminism, riot girl feminism, all of these different sorts of flavors of feminism. So the third wave was a much more diverse movement. And it also was very, very important for really highlighting sexual harassment and sexual violence against women and how it was still prevalent, especially among powerful men, right? And so Tarana Burke, Tarana is the woman in the picture up top here. She launched the Me Too movement. She started using it way back in 2006, but in 2017, it turned into an international movement exposing and opposing sexual violence against women. So third wave feminism doing really important work, still going today. And it is still so obviously important that that women are advocating for these things, especially for more awareness to be shed on sexual harassment and sexual violence. And so today, just to wrap up, there's a really difficult situation right now uh, taking place in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada, is that there's kind of been a number of conservative political movements that are trying to roll back some of these rights that women have fought so hard for over the last century. We saw this about 10 years ago when our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, he was a conservative prime minister, and he rolled back several women's rights initiatives across the country. He closed a bunch of status of women offices. He opposed the federal child care program. Like he was really anti women's rights. So that was a setback in Canada. Of course, in the United States, things are even more intense right now. There's serious attacks on women's rights. For instance, Roe v. Wade, which was the legal decision that was the basis of abortion rights in the States, that was overturned in 2022. And this has led to a really distressing situation where there are now abortion bans happening in several states, right? So women can no longer access safe abortion, which was a right that women had to fight really, really hard for. So at the end of the day, that's where we're at with gender in Canada. There have been a lot of struggles to make the expression of gender more equal and more neutral in our society. There have been a lot of attempts to ensure that yeah, that all genders and all gender expressions have equal access to their human and citizenship rights, and it's an ongoing challenge. So I will leave it at that, folks. Apologies for the all the coughing and the hacking, and I hope I'm in better shape on Monday. Okay, take care, folks.